If you have ever prayed in your room, day after day, year after year, you need to understand something powerful. Your room is not just four walls, a ceiling, a floor, and a bed. Your room is a spiritual archive, a sanctuary disguised as ordinary, a place where heaven has leaned close enough to hear you whisper through tears, through hope, through exhaustion, through faith. Hit that subscribe button and let's grow in faith, love, and truth. What you see as a simple space, angels see as a battlefield, a birthplace, a meeting ground between the natural and the divine. Every prayer you ever prayed, every plea, every breakthrough, every surrender, left an imprint in that room. Heaven did not forget. The walls remember, the atmosphere remembers, the angels remember. You think nothing has changed because everything looks the same. But in the spirit, your room is glowing. Because when a room has been saturated in years of prayer, the atmosphere shifts, the ground becomes holy, the space becomes guarded. Angels begin to move differently. Darkness cannot sit comfortably there anymore. Your room becomes a place where heaven has history. So before we go further, you need to know the truth about what your prayers have built in the unseen. Number 1. The atmosphere of the room becomes spiritually charged. There is something remarkable that begins to happen in a room that has held years of prayers, whispered petitions, silent tears, midnight conversations with God, and early morning surrender. At first, nothing looks different. The walls are the same, the furniture is unchanged, the light enters the window as it always has. But in the unseen realm, the atmosphere is being transformed little by little, prayer by prayer, breath by breath. Every moment you bowed your head, every time you lifted your spirit, every time you called on God within those four walls, something sacred was deposited into the atmosphere. And while your natural eyes might overlook it, heaven does not. Angels do not. Your spirit does not. Over time, the room becomes spiritually charged, alive, sensitive, responsive, holding the residue of every encounter you've ever had with God. The spiritual atmosphere of a room is not created instantly. It builds the way dew gathers on grass, quietly, steadily, without fanfare. Every prayer leaves an imprint. Every word of worship becomes a seed. Every moment of surrender becomes a mark. Your room becomes a sanctuary, not because it is decorated with symbols, but because it has hosted your vulnerability and your devotion. Heaven honors the places where you've chosen to seek God consistently. And the more you pray in a room, the more heaven begins to treat that space as an altar, a place where divine presence can descend freely and where angels can move without resistance. A spiritually charged atmosphere feels different, even if you cannot fully explain it. You walk into the room and there is a softness, a stillness, a peace that sits on the air. Your mind settles more quickly. Your thoughts quiet themselves without force. Your heart feels understood before you even begin to speak. The atmosphere itself begins to minister to you, not because the room holds magic, but because the presence of God has hovered there so many times that the atmosphere remembers Him. Prayer saturates a space. It cleanses it. It purifies it. It changes the frequency of the room. Things that once felt heavy no longer linger. Thoughts that once brought anxiety lose their footing. The spiritual climate shifts from ordinary to consecrated. When angels enter a room that has been filled with years of prayer, they recognize it instantly. They see what the human eye cannot see. They see the glow of worship lingering in the corners. They see the imprints of moments when your spirit cried out for strength. They see the trails of peace that flowed through the air after a night of surrender. They see the residue of battles fought and won in the unseen realm. To angels, a prayed-in room is bright. It is active. It is warm. It is holy ground. They do not see old furniture and faint shadows. They see a spiritual history written in light. They move through that space more freely because it is familiar to them, a place where heaven has been welcomed repeatedly. The more you pray in a room, the more sensitive your spirit becomes when you enter it. You may feel conviction rise there more quickly. You may receive clarity there more easily. You may sense God drawing near without needing to ask. This is because prayer transforms the spiritual density of a space. A prayed-in room becomes thin between realms. It becomes the kind of environment where God speaks softly, and you still hear him clearly. You do not need to strive. You do not need to force connection. The atmosphere itself has been conditioned to host revelation. Even your emotions behave differently in a room filled with prayer. Fear has a harder time attaching to you there. Anxiety loses its voice more quickly. Sadness cannot linger long. Peace settles like a blanket. Hope rises without effort. Your inner world becomes strengthened simply by being in the environment you helped build through years of communion. The room becomes a refuge, a safe place, a spiritual shelter from the storms of life. What angels see when they enter your prayed-in room is not just an atmosphere charged with presence. It is a place marked by your growth. They see the nights you walked in, weak and left strengthened. They see the mornings when you sat on the edge of the bed with tears in your eyes, feeling broken, but still whispered, "Help me." They see the moments when you almost gave up, but found yourself praying again anyway. Every struggle, every surrender, every breakthrough becomes part of the atmosphere. Prayer writes your spiritual story on the air itself. Over time, your room becomes a training ground, a place where your faith has matured, a place where you have learned to listen, a place where you have learned to fight spiritually, a place where you have learned to trust God even when his silence felt heavy, a place where heaven and earth have met repeatedly, and the atmosphere remembers every encounter. You are not the same person you were when you first prayed there, and the room is not the same room either. Both have evolved. Both have grown. Both have been shaped by the presence of God. A spiritually charged room also becomes a place where darkness cannot rest. Things that once disturbed your spirit no longer feel at home. Confusion cannot take root. Oppression does not linger. Spiritual interference weakens. The atmosphere itself rejects anything that is not aligned with heaven. Angels stand guard more easily because the environment has already been sanctified by your consistency. You created a spiritual boundary without realizing it simply by showing up, praying, and surrendering again and again. And perhaps the most beautiful part of a spiritually charged room is that it welcomes you back, even when you feel far from God. You may walk in feeling empty, tired, disconnected, or unworthy, but the atmosphere greets you with the echoes of every prayer you've ever prayed. Your past devotion begins to minister to your present weakness. The room lifts you, reminds you, calls you. This space has held your spirit in both your highest and lowest moments, and because of that, it is saturated with grace. This is what happens after years of prayer. The room becomes more than a room. It becomes a sanctuary, a witness, a spiritual reservoir holding the presence of God, the ministry of angels, and the imprint of your faith. And every time you step into that room, heaven meets you all over again, not because you earned it, but because you created space for it. Number 2, prayer changes the spiritual climate permanently, creating a place where peace settles and darkness cannot linger. There are places in this world where the air feels different the moment you step inside, places that seem to breathe with a quiet strength, rooms that carry a stillness not found anywhere else. These places are not sanctuaries built by human hands, but atmospheres shaped by years of whispered prayers, midnight intercessions, quiet tears, and surrendered moments between you and God. Prayer does not simply rise from a room and disappear. Prayer saturates. Prayer lingers. Prayer becomes woven into the air itself. Over time, every word you've spoken, every plea, every surrender, every worshipful whisper begins to reshape the unseen climate of your space. Your room becomes something more than four walls. It becomes a spiritual refuge where peace settles like a thick blanket, where heaviness lifts without instruction, where darkness recognizes it has no authority and leaves before it even tries to enter. Prayer alters the climate long before you realize it. You may think you are just praying to survive a season, or praying out of desperation, or praying through tears, but heaven is building something with those prayers. One prayer plants a seed, a year of prayers plants a garden, and years of prayers create a spiritual atmosphere so transformed that even angels recognize the space before you do. They see layers of intercession covering your walls like invisible light. They see battles won in silence. They see chains broken before dawn. They see the residue of every prayer rising like incense, creating a spiritual climate that cannot be penetrated by fear or darkness. People often imagine spiritual climates as something distant or abstract, but in reality, the spiritual climate of your room is shaped by what you have allowed to live in it. Doubt leaves residue. Fear lingers in corners. Unresolved wounds create heaviness. But prayer uproots every trace of what does not belong. Prayer sweeps through the atmosphere like a cleansing wind. It pushes out what drains you. It unclogs the spiritual air. What you once felt without understanding, those moments of heaviness, anxiety, or spiritual resistance, begins to lift. And in its place comes a peace that does not make sense in earthly terms. You walk into your room and feel lighter, calmer, held. That is not emotion, that is spiritual climate. Peace is not the absence of noise, it is the presence of God. And when a room has been saturated with prayer for years, the presence of God becomes the dominant atmosphere. It settles into the fabric of the space. It seeps into the silence. It waits for you when you come home tired. It surrounds you when your mind is overwhelmed. It steadies you when your heart is fragile. Peace becomes the first thing you feel when you cross the threshold because the room has been trained to host it. Prayer does this. Prayer trains your atmosphere. Prayer teaches your environment where peace belongs. Darkness cannot coexist with this kind of climate. It can try to approach, but it cannot enter. It can try to whisper, but its voice will not carry. It can try to disturb your rest, but the atmosphere rejects it instantly. Darkness is not afraid of people. Darkness is afraid of presence. And when your room becomes a place where the presence of God dwells consistently, darkness simply has no oxygen to survive. There are things you used to struggle with, nightmares, anxieties, fears, that suddenly lose their power not because you became stronger overnight, but because your environment shifted. Your room became a place where darkness has no foothold. You did not just pray for peace, you prayed peace into existence. Prayer not only changes the climate, it makes the change permanent. The spiritual atmosphere becomes conditioned, reinforced by every prayer you have ever spoken. Even when you are not praying, the room remembers, the walls remember, the air remembers. There is a residue of holiness in places where you've knelt, where you've wept, where you've surrendered. This residue becomes a shield around the atmosphere, a quiet guardian that keeps the room spiritually warm even when life feels cold. Over time, the room becomes a reservoir for your spirit. When you enter it weary, something in the atmosphere begins repairing you before you even speak. When you enter anxious, something begins settling you. When you enter confused, something begins clarifying your thoughts. When you enter broken, something begins stitching together the pieces. Prayer has shaped the climate so deeply that your room becomes a sanctuary for restoration. You may not even realize how much healing happens simply because you are standing in the presence you cultivated over the years. Angels are drawn to spaces like this, places where the spiritual climate is clean, charged, peaceful. They see the room glowing in the spirit with a soft brilliance invisible to human eyes. They see a boundary around it that darkness cannot cross. They see the prayers still active, still working, still echoing in the unseen realms. They linger in these rooms because the climate aligns with the light they carry. When you pray, angels move. When you pray consistently, angels reside. And when the climate of your room becomes a habitation for heavenly presence, you begin to live surrounded by protection, clarity, and guidance without fully understanding why. Prayer also shifts the climate of your mind when you are in that space. A prayed-in room becomes a place where your thoughts quiet faster, where your worries cannot scream as loudly, where your fears cannot anchor themselves. You sit on your bed and suddenly feel unsafe thoughts losing grip. You lie down and feel your mind surrender to rest more easily. You begin thinking clearer, dreaming clearer, hearing God clearer, because the climate supports spiritual clarity, not spiritual confusion. Even your sleep becomes different. Sleep in a prayed-in room becomes deeper, more restorative, more peaceful. Nighttime attacks that used to feel heavy become weakened. Anxiety that used to wake you up in the middle of the night fades. The climate itself defends your rest. You may wake at 3 a.m. sometimes, but instead of fear, you feel peace. Instead of pressure, you feel presence. Instead of attack, you feel invitation. The room becomes a cradle for spiritual encounters, a safe space where God can speak freely and your spirit can listen without interference. Nothing changes the atmosphere of a room like prayer. Not music, not decor, not positive thinking. Only prayer reaches into the unseen and rearranges the spiritual molecules of the air itself. Only prayer builds a climate strong enough to destroy darkness. Only prayer carves out a sanctuary inside ordinary walls. And when this climate becomes permanent, your room ceases to be just a room. It becomes holy ground. It becomes a sacred environment charged with the presence of God, a place where angels walk freely, where peace sits like a guardian, where darkness cannot linger long enough to harm you. This is the blessing of prayed-in spaces. They remember. They hold what was released in them. They transform into anchors of stability, clarity, and protection. And as long as you continue to pray, the climate continues to strengthen until even you begin to notice that something powerful lives within the quiet of your room. A peace that outlasts storms, a presence that never leaves, and a climate that makes your space a refuge not only for your body, but for your soul. Number 3. Angels recognize the room as a place of divine activity. There is something sacred that happens to a room when it becomes a place of prayer. A place where your tears have fallen, where your whispers rose into the air, where your heart learned to bend before God instead of breaking apart under the world's weight. Over time, the room begins to hold a different kind of presence, a different kind of fragrance, a different kind of stillness. What seems ordinary to the eye becomes extraordinary in the spirit. What feels familiar to you becomes holy ground to angels. And the moment an angel enters a room like this, your room, your sanctuary, there is a recognition, a reverence, an awareness that this place is not just a collection of walls and light and furniture. It is a place of divine activity, a place where heaven has touched earth again and again. Angels are not drawn to decoration. They are not drawn to perfection. They are drawn to devotion. They recognize environments by atmosphere, not by appearance. And when a room has been saturated by years of seeking, years of surrender, years of calling on God in the darkness, angels feel the residue of those moments long before you ever sense their presence. They feel the weight of prayer soaked into the air like oil. They feel the consistency of your faith echoing through the walls. They feel the memories of every midnight you rose because something in your spirit refused to sleep until it touched heaven. To angels, this room is not just where you live, it is where heaven moves. Every time you prayed, something shifted in the fabric of that space. You may not have seen it, but angels did. They saw the atmosphere bend under the sound of your faith. They saw light break through spiritual heaviness. They saw darkness retreat every time you whispered the name of God. They saw your tears hit the floor and turn into strength. They saw the way heaven responded when you refused to give up, even when you could have. And because of these moments, they no longer see this room as an ordinary environment. They see it as an altar, a meeting place, a resting place for divine presence. Angels recognize patterns. They recognize consistency. They recognize devotion. When they step into your room, they do not just see a space, they see history. They see the spiritual story written into the atmosphere. They see every moment your heart cried for something deeper. They see every breakthrough that began in the quiet before dawn. They see every chain that broke while your voice trembled through a prayer you barely had strength to speak. They see every time heaven leaned close to answer you. And because of this, your room becomes marked in the spiritual realm, marked as a place where God is sought, marked as a place where faith rises, marked as a place where angels have permission to move freely. There are places in the world where spiritual activity is thick, almost tangible. Churches, altars, mountaintops, prayer rooms, and unknown to many, your personal room can carry the same weight. Angels feel it. They know when a place has become a well of spiritual activity. They know when heaven has been invited repeatedly. They know when God's presence has been honored there. When your room becomes a place where you meet with God regularly, angels step into it not as visitors, but as assigned guardians, messengers, and ministers. They know this place. They know the way your spirit opens when you kneel. They know the way your voice changes when you shift from fear to faith. They know the way peace descends when you surrender your worries at the foot of invisible mercy. This is why sometimes, even before you pray, you feel a heaviness lift. Angels have already been at work. They cleanse the atmosphere. They remove distractions. They guard the perimeter of your mind. They push back spiritual interference so that when you speak, your words reach heaven without opposition. They prepare the space the same way attendants would prepare a room for a king. Because when you pray, the king does enter. Angels recognize those rooms. Over years of prayer, angels also begin to see your room as a place where God's river flows. Every prayer you've spoken became part of a spiritual stream. Some prayers asked for strength, some for guidance, some for healing, some for forgiveness, some for miracles, some for endurance. All of them left traces of glory in the atmosphere. Angels can see these traces like streams of light woven into the room. They see your faith like fire. They see your surrender like incense. They see your hope like rising smoke. To them, the room becomes alive. Alive with past encounters, alive with answered prayers, alive with promises that have not yet manifested but are already written in heaven's book. Sometimes you wonder why, when you walk into your room after a long day, you suddenly feel peace. You wonder why your body relaxes, why your spirit settles, why your breathing softens. It is not because of familiarity, it is because the atmosphere has been shaped by prayer. Angels recognize this peace. They protect it. They enlarge it. They keep the air clear so that when you return weary, the room becomes restoration instead of another place of exhaustion. There are moments when angels linger even after your prayer is done. The room remains spiritually active because heaven responds not just to prayer, but to the consistency behind it. Angels stay because your devotion created a spiritual home for them, a place where heaven can visit freely, a place where light rests effortlessly, a place where the divine and the human meet. Your room may look ordinary to anyone else, but to angels, it is a place where battles were fought and won, where healing began, where faith rose in the darkness, where you learned to trust God even when life offered no guarantees. Angels honor places like this. They guard places like this. They recognize that this is a room where the presence of God has been welcomed again and again. So when you enter your room and feel something different, something calming, something sacred, that is not imagination. That is recognition. Recognition from heaven, recognition from angels, recognition from the spiritual realm that this space, this quiet space, has become a divine landmark, a place where God has met you, a place where angels move freely, a place where prayer has shaped the atmosphere into holy ground. And every time you kneel again, every time you whisper again, every time you surrender again, the room becomes more radiant to the eyes of angels, more active, more sacred, more filled with light. Because prayer does not just change your life. It changes your room. It marks the atmosphere. It signals to heaven that this is a place where God is sought, where faith lives, and where angels are welcomed. Your room is no longer just a room. It is a sanctuary recognized by angels as a place of divine activity, a place where heaven has history, and where more of it is still being written. It becomes marked, a location where heaven consistently visits and assignments increase. Number 4, battles fought in the spirit leave imprints of victory in the atmosphere. There are things that happen in the unseen that your natural eyes will never fully grasp. Yet your spirit feels them every time you walk into the room. Every whispered prayer, every tear that fell onto your pillow, every moment you lifted your hands in surrender, every night you cried out for strength, every early morning you chose faith over fear. None of it vanished into the air. It stayed. It settled. It shaped the atmosphere. Because in the spiritual realm, battles are not forgotten. They leave marks, imprints, shifts, evidence that something powerful happened in the quiet, hidden, sacred corners of your life. And when angels look at your room after years of prayers, they do not see walls and furniture. They see the residue of victory layered in the atmosphere like spiritual fingerprints. Your room becomes a battleground that has tasted triumph. You may not realize how many nights heaven fought on your behalf. You may not know how many attacks were intercepted before they ever reached you. You may not know how many lies from the enemy were dismantled while you slept. But angels know. They stood there. They fought there. They guarded you when your spirit was too tired to guard itself. And every victory they won, every darkness they pushed back, every heaviness they lifted, every snare they broke, left an imprint in the air around you. These imprints are not visible to the natural eye, but spiritually they glow with the evidence of God's faithfulness. There have been nights when you woke suddenly, not knowing why your chest felt lighter than it did when you fell asleep. It was because a battle had ended. Something broke, something lifted, something released. Sometimes victory arrives quietly. Sometimes it sneaks into the morning wrapped in peace. Sometimes you do not hear the warfare, but you feel the result. That feeling is not imagination. It is residue. It is evidence that a spiritual battle was fought and heaven prevailed. Angels see these victories. They remember every one. They mark the room with the triumph your spirit could not see. Battles fought in the spirit do not disappear. They transform the atmosphere. Darkness that once tried to linger cannot return easily because it knows what happened there. It recognizes resistance. It recognizes angelic presence. It recognizes authority. When you pray through the night, When you refuse to let fear take root, when you declare God's promises into the air, the atmosphere of your room changes. It becomes harder for spiritual heaviness to enter. It becomes uncomfortable for the enemy. It becomes a place marked by previous victories, a territory that no longer welcomes darkness. Sometimes you walk into your room after a long day and feel a peace you can't explain. That peace is not accidental. It is inherited. It is the leftover calm from battles fought on nights you don't remember. It is the echo of past moments when your prayers shook the unseen realm. Angels look at your room and see layers of breakthrough. They see where peace settled like dew. They see where fear was uprooted. They see where faith stood firm. They see the imprints of every spiritual win, and those victories continue to speak even when you have forgotten the battles that birthed them. Victory in the spirit realm changes the very structure of a room. It strengthens the atmosphere. It fortifies the air. It becomes harder for the enemy to operate in a place where heaven has fought fiercely. Angels recognize this. They move differently in rooms marked by victory. The room becomes familiar to them, a place where divine assignments have been fulfilled, a place where praise rose like incense, a place where prayers built altars in the unseen. To angels, your room is not ordinary. It is sacred ground. The walls carry memory. The floor remembers surrender. The ceiling remembers your cries. And the atmosphere remembers every triumph. Spiritual battles do not always feel victorious in the moment. Some of your greatest victories came during the nights you felt weakest. Some battles were won while you were trembling. Some breakthroughs came through tears you thought were wasted. But the spirit realm does not mark you by how strong you felt. It marks you by what was accomplished. The trembling prayer still broke the chain. The tear-stained cry still reached heaven. The whispered scripture still pushed back darkness. Your room carries the imprints of those moments. To angels, it shines with the memory of triumph. There are times when heaviness tries to settle again, when fear tries to find an entry point, when old patterns attempt to resurface. Yet the moment you step into that room, something rises within you. Strength returns, clarity returns, peace returns. Why? Because victory has already been won in that space. The atmosphere does not forget. Darkness remembers defeat. And angels remember their assignment. They stand guard where they once fought. They protect what was gained. They reinforce the territory your prayers claimed. Even when you move through seasons of doubt, even when your faith feels thin, even when your prayers feel small, the atmosphere of your room continues to carry the imprint of what has already happened. The victories of yesterday protect you today. They become anchors for your spirit. They become reminders for your heart. They become barriers against anything that tries to disturb your peace. You are never stepping into an untouched space. You are stepping into a room layered with history, your history with God. To angels, your room is a memorial of every moment God stepped in, a monument of every night heaven surrounded you, a living testimony of every spiritual battle that ended in triumph. And the more you pray, the more victories accumulate. The atmosphere becomes thicker with God's presence. The air becomes heavier with peace. The room becomes a resting place for angelic activity. Every battle that ends in victory deepens the spiritual strength of your room, turning it into a place where darkness does not feel comfortable lingering. This is why sometimes you feel emotional when you begin to pray in that room. The atmosphere recognizes your voice. It remembers your prayers. It carries the imprint of past encounters. The moment you open your mouth, the air shifts because it remembers what prayer has done there before. Every word you speak joins the history of all the prayers already spoken. Angels stand at attention because they know this territory well. They know what happens when you pray here. They know the victories that have already taken place. They know the spiritual assignments fulfilled in this space. Your room has become a sanctuary because of the battles fought within it. A sanctuary shaped not by decor, but by devotion. Not by furniture, but by faith. Not by appearance, but by spiritual encounters. The victories may be invisible to the human eye, but they are undeniable in the spirit realm. Angels see a room where God has moved, a room where darkness has retreated, a room where chains have broken, a room where burdens lifted, a room where peace prevailed, and they stand guard over it with reverence. The imprint of victory is not temporary, it is lasting. It becomes part of the spiritual identity of the room. It strengthens you without your awareness. It protects you without your permission. It surrounds you without your efforts. And every time you pray again, every time you worship again, every time you surrender again, those imprints deepen, carving a deeper history of triumph into the walls of the unseen. So when you enter your room and feel something holy resting there, understand this. You are walking into a place marked by battles you survived. A place stamped with victories heaven remembers. A place where angels once fought and still stand ready. The atmosphere has been shaped by your prayers and by God's power. And every breath you take in that room is a reminder that victory was written into the air long before you realized it. Your room carries the imprint of triumph, because heaven fought there, and heaven won. Number 5. The room holds the echoes of every prayer spoken. There is something sacred that happens in a room where prayers have been whispered for years, something invisible but undeniably present, something that lingers long after your voice grows quiet and your tears have dried on the pillow. In the physical world, sound fades, words dissolve, silence returns. But in the spiritual world, nothing spoken in sincerity ever disappears. Every prayer you have ever released into the air leaves an imprint, a vibration, a resonance that does not fade with time. Heaven hears every syllable, and the room where those prayers were birthed holds their echoes like a spiritual memory carved into the atmosphere. A room becomes holy not because of architecture or decoration, but because of what has been spoken within its walls. When your voice breaks in surrender, when your knees touch the floor in desperation, when your heart opens in honesty, when your soul cries out for guidance, for strength, for healing, for clarity. These moments shape the air around you. They carve grooves into the unseen. They teach the atmosphere how to bow to God's presence. And long after the prayer ends, the room remembers. The echoes of prayer are not noise. They are imprints of intimacy. When you pour out your soul before dawn, when you whisper prayers in the darkness, when you release gratitude before stepping into the day, your room becomes a vessel of those moments. It holds the vibrations of your seeking. It holds the weight of your surrender. It holds the emotion of your petitions. Even when you forget the words you prayed, the room does not. It preserves the spiritual residue of every plea, every confession, every moment of worship. There are nights when you walk into your room after a long day and suddenly feel peace wrap around you. Nothing external changed. The room is the same. The world outside is still chaotic, but something meets you at the doorway. That peace is not random. It is the echo of every prayer you have spoken in that place. It is the atmosphere remembering your faith. It is the spiritual residue of your communion with God rising again to greet you. Prayers do not die, they settle, they rest, they live in the spaces where they were released, creating an environment where your weary heart can breathe again. Sometimes you sit on your bed and tears fall without warning. Not from sadness, but from a deep spiritual awareness that something holy surrounds you. This is the room echoing back the times you cried there, not in despair, but in surrender. Heaven remembers those tears, and so does the room. Tears shed in prayer are not wasted. They fertilize the spiritual ground. They seep into the atmosphere like seeds watered by faith. When you return to that place, the echoes stir, reminding your spirit that God heard you then and still hears you now. Even angels recognize the resonance of prayers spoken over time. To them, your room is not just a space. It is a spiritual archive, a place marked by the consistency of your devotion, a room filled with the lingering fragrance of your petitions. Prayers leave a signature, a scent, a glow visible only in the spiritual realm. Angels walk through that room and see the trails of every moment you cried out for help, every time you sought direction, every time you worshipped when you felt empty. They see the echoes, not as fading sounds, but as living testimonies of your faithfulness and God's response. And there are moments when you wake up unexpectedly in the middle of the night and your spirit feels stirred. It feels like you're being nudged. Sometimes that nudge comes from the prayers you have already prayed. They rise like reminders, calling you back to alignment, urging you into communion. You are not waking up to new words, you are waking up to old prayers calling you forward. The room speaks through the echoes of what you once laid at the feet of God. It holds the memory of your promises, your vows, your declarations, and your breakthroughs. The echoes of prayer also create a spiritual familiarity. Even if you move furniture, repaint the walls, change the decor, something in the room remains unchanged. It feels like home, not because of comfort, but because of consistency. Your spirit recognizes the ground where you learn to trust. The atmosphere recognizes the faith you grew there. Rooms remember the prayers that built them. And long after the outward world shifts, that inner spiritual familiarity remains. There are times when you bring someone else into your room and they comment on the peace they feel. They do not know why. They cannot articulate it. They cannot name it. That peace is not personality. It is not mood. It is not coincidence. It is the echo of the prayers you prayed when no one was there to witness. The prayers you whispered when you didn't have answers. The prayers you repeated when all you had was trust. People feel what the room has stored. Your room becomes a sanctuary not by design, but by devotion. It becomes a spiritual refuge, a place where heaven has been invited repeatedly, where the presence of God has become familiar, where angels have stood guard, where peace has settled, where battles have been fought and won. The room carries the spiritual memory of everything God has done in your life. And each time you return to pray again, you are not starting from scratch. You are continuing a conversation already etched into the atmosphere. The echoes of prayer also create strength in seasons when you feel weak. Sometimes you walk into your room and feel courage rise without effort. You didn't speak it. You didn't command it. You didn't produce it. It rises because your room has heard you declare strength before. It knows the tone of your resilience. It remembers your proclamations of faith. The echoes minister back to you what you once released into them. And even when you go through seasons where prayer feels difficult, when words do not come easily, when your spirit feels tired, when your faith feels stretched, the room stands as a reminder of your history with God. It testifies to every moment you pushed through, every prayer you spoke through trembling lips, every night you knelt in vulnerability. The room becomes evidence that you are not starting over. You are continuing something sacred. Years of prayer carve history into the air. They engrave presence into the walls. They saturate the ground with spiritual residue. And every time you step into the room again, you step into the echoes of your own faithfulness and the echo of God's unbroken response. Your prayers do not vanish. They remain. They settle, they echo, they create a sanctuary that continues to speak long after you fall silent. And the room, your room, becomes a living testament that heaven has heard you over and over again. Number 6, the room becomes a beacon in the spiritual realm. There comes a moment in the life of a praying person when the room they've prayed in is no longer just a space where they sleep, think, or rest. It becomes something deeper, something radiant, something recognized in realms you cannot see with human eyes. A room saturated with years of prayer does not remain ordinary. It becomes a beacon, a signal, a spiritual lighthouse shining into dimensions your natural senses cannot perceive. Heaven sees it, angels see it, and even the forces of darkness see it and tremble. Every whispered prayer, every tear released, every moment of surrender sends out a spiritual frequency. It rises like incense and settles like light. At first, the change is invisible. You don't feel it every time. You don't always notice when it shifts. But heaven notices. Slowly, over months and years, the room becomes marked. It begins glowing, not with earthly brightness, but with spiritual brilliance. Angels see the glow from afar. Heaven identifies it instantly. Your room becomes a place that carries the signature of someone who consistently meets with God. In the spiritual realm, such places are rare. Many homes have noise, many rooms have activity, but few have prayer. And prayer is what separates an ordinary space from a sacred one. When prayer becomes consistent, earnest, and sustained over years, the room begins to emit a spiritual light that burns even in the darkest hours. It becomes a beacon, signaling to the angels that this is a place where God is welcomed, where His presence is honored, where His voice is heard, and they respond to that signal every time. This beacon is not a sudden burst of brilliance. It grows gradually, like embers turning into flame. There were nights when you prayed through exhaustion and heaven marked it. There were mornings when you surrendered your worries before the sun rose and heaven marked it. There were seasons when prayer felt dry, when tears felt empty, when words barely formed, but heaven marked those too. The beacon is not built from perfect prayers, but from persistent ones. It is constructed from years of showing up, even when you didn't feel strong, even when doubt tried to silence you, even when life pressed against your spirit. Angels recognize the glow immediately. To them, it is a signal of divine activity. It is a home base for heavenly movement. It is a location marked by obedience, faithfulness, and spiritual hunger. Your room becomes a place where instructions are delivered, where warnings are intercepted, where comfort is administered, where battles are fought and won. The beacon tells the spiritual realm, this is ground heaven has permission to move in, and heaven responds. But the beacon also speaks to darkness. It sends out a warning. It tells every opposing force, this territory is not yours. Approach at your own risk. Darkness does not like entering a room that glows. It does not like crossing the threshold of a space saturated with faith. The beacon disrupts demonic activity before it begins. It frustrates assignments that were whispered in shadows. It confuses strategies formed against you. It blinds the enemy's sight. It makes your room a place where darkness cannot linger, cannot rest, cannot find comfort. This is why sometimes you feel peace in your room, even when your life feels chaotic. The atmosphere has been marked. The light has been established. The beacon continues shining even on the days you feel too weak to pray. Darkness may try to press against the walls of your mind, but it cannot fully enter the space because it has been claimed by your consistency. What angels see when they look at your room is not just a space. It is a spiritual signal that you belong to God and that this territory has been set apart. The beacon also attracts revelation. Divine insight comes easier in a room that glows. Your spirit becomes more sensitive. Your intuition becomes clearer. Your dreams become more meaningful. You begin to feel direction, wisdom, conviction, or peace more quickly because the environment supports spiritual hearing. It is easier for heaven to speak in a place where heaven's presence has been invited repeatedly. So when God wants to whisper something, he often brings it to you in that room, because the room has become a spiritual sanctuary where your heart is open enough to hear. There are moments when you walk into your room and feel an unexplainable warmth. Other times, you may sense a heaviness lifting the moment you close the door. You may feel clarity without effort, or peace without reason, or strength without visible support. These are the effects of the beacon. You are stepping into a spiritually illuminated space. The light that heaven sees spills into your emotions, your thoughts, your energy. The beacon does not shine only outward, it shines inward, shaping you from the inside out. When angels move through your room, they do so confidently because the beacon guides them. It tells them where they are needed. It tells them where activity is happening. It tells them where the heart is open and prayer is alive. They are drawn to that glow like guardians, like messengers, like warriors sent on assignment. And every time you pray, you strengthen the signal. You increase the glow. You deepen the mark. Every prayer makes the beacon brighter, more potent, more spiritually disruptive to anything not aligned with God's will. This beacon is also generational. Long after you have left that room, after you move, after life shifts, after seasons change, the spiritual imprint remains. The light fades slowly but deeply. It lingers in the walls, in the atmosphere, in the very air. Someone else may enter the room and feel peace without knowing why. Someone may sleep there and dream vividly without understanding what shaped the environment. Prayer leaves residue. Faith leaves fragrance. Devotion leaves imprint. The beacon you built continues speaking long after your voice has left the room. Over time, the beacon becomes a testimony. It tells heaven who you are. It tells darkness who you refuse to be. It tells your own soul where to go when you feel lost. It becomes a guiding light in your spiritual life, a place to return to when confusion rises, when heaviness presses, when life becomes overwhelming. The room calls you back to alignment because it remembers the prayers that shaped it, the battles that were won in it, the tears that watered its atmosphere. It becomes holy ground, not because of the furniture, but because of the faith. And heaven honors what you built. The spiritual realm sees it. The angels respond to it. Darkness respects it, and your spirit finds rest within it. Your room becomes more than a place. It becomes a beacon, a light, a signal in the unseen world that something sacred lives here, something awakened breathes here, something heaven recognizes as its own. Number 7. The presence of God becomes more tangible and settled. There comes a point in a praying person's life when the presence of God stops feeling like a visitor and begins to feel like a resident. Not because he was ever far, but because your consistency created a resting place. Your room becomes more than 4 walls and a ceiling. It becomes a sanctuary, a dwelling, a place where heaven's nearness no longer feels fleeting, but familiar. The presence of God begins to settle, not as a moment that comes and goes, but as an atmosphere that remains. It becomes the quiet foundation beneath everything you do, the unseen weight that steadies your spirit, the gentle warmth that lingers long after the prayer ends. You do not have to strain to feel him anymore. You do not have to fight through noise or anxiety to sense him. He is there, not because he suddenly decided to show up, but because your prayers carved out a holy space where his presence can rest. When God's presence becomes settled, the room feels different, even on the days you do not pray aloud. You walk in and something shifts inside you. Your breathing slows, your shoulders relax, your thoughts soften. The unseen takes precedence over the seen. Peace rises like a quiet tide. The room feels alive, though nothing moves. It feels full, though no one else is physically there. You can sense the residue of past encounters, moments when your tears hit the floor and heaven rushed in. Moments when your words cracked open something in the spirit, and God filled the space. These moments do not evaporate. They settle into the walls, into the air, into the atmosphere. They transform the room from a natural space into a spiritual refuge. A settled presence means you no longer need emotional intensity to feel connected. God begins to reveal himself in whispers instead of thunder, in soft impressions instead of shaking encounters. The maturity of his presence is quieter but stronger, subtle but undeniable. It is the difference between a fire that flares high for a moment and a flame that burns steadily through the night. You begin to experience him not only during prayer, but in the stillness afterward. In the moments when you fold clothes, in the moments when you sit quietly, in the moments when you wake in the middle of the night and feel a peace that does not belong to the world. His presence becomes a quiet companion that fills the room long after the prayer ends. When God's presence settles, darkness loses confidence. It does not try to challenge the atmosphere the way it used to. The weight of his nearness becomes a shield. A room soaked in prayer takes on the authority of the one who dwells within it. It is not just your words that shift the atmosphere anymore, it is his presence itself. Darkness recognizes territory. And your room, once ordinary, becomes a place darkness cannot comfortably linger. Not because you are intimidating, but because the one who rests there is unshakable. A settled presence means angels move with ease in the atmosphere. The room becomes a space where heaven's activity feels natural, unhindered by the static of spiritual interference. Divine assignments flow freely. Ministering spirits enter with purpose. The atmosphere carries the same spiritual weight as a sanctuary where countless prayers have been lifted over generations. It is a room that echoes with agreement between heaven and earth, and angels recognize it as a place where God's presence has chosen to rest. You begin to notice changes within yourself as well. Your spirit becomes more sensitive to God's voice. Your thoughts align more quickly with truth. Your emotions become less reactive and more anchored. You find yourself receiving clarity without needing to ask. The presence that rests in the room spills over into your mind, your behaviors, your decisions. You become spiritually attuned in a way that surprises even you. This is not accidental. It is the natural result of living inside an atmosphere shaped by God's nearness. There are moments when you enter the room without the intention to pray, yet prayer rises naturally within you. Not forced, not pressured, just drawn, as if the room itself reminds you who you are, as if the atmosphere breathes, "Come sit with him again." This is what happens when presence settles. The space becomes a magnet for your spirit. You begin to crave the quiet. You begin to long for the stillness. You begin to expect him, not because of emotion, but because of consistency. You grow accustomed to his nearness until being without it feels unnatural. A room marked by God's presence becomes a place of healing. Wounds you carried unknowingly begin to mend. Fears dissolve not through effort, but through exposure to his peace. Heavy emotions lose their grip simply because they cannot coexist with the settled weight of divine presence. Healing becomes something that happens to you, not just something you pray for. God's presence untangles what your heart struggled to manage. It reaches into the deep places, the silent aches, the unspoken anxieties, and begins to restore what life attempted to unravel. God's presence also becomes a teacher in the quiet. You start receiving insights without searching for them. You begin to understand Scripture with clarity you did not have before. You receive wisdom in moments when your mind feels still. Questions that once tormented you soften into understanding. His presence does not just rest in your room, it begins to shape your inner life. And what he teaches you in the quiet becomes the strength you carry into the rest of the world. A settled presence means that your room becomes a place God chooses to meet you, not because he could not meet you elsewhere, but because he honors the consistency of your seeking. Heaven responds to persistence. God honors dedication. A room that has hosted countless prayers becomes a place where his glory rests easily. You have created an altar not made of stone, but of moments, not carved by hands, but carved by devotion. And God fills what you have faithfully offered. Over time, his presence becomes so tangible that even others feel it when they enter the room. They may not understand it. They may not have your language for it, but they sense peace. They sense warmth. They sense something different. They sense the residue of God's nearness. Your room becomes a witness, a testimony, a quiet sanctuary to anyone who steps inside. They encounter the afterglow of your prayers, the lingering assurance of his presence, the spiritual weight that has settled through years of devotion. And you, the one who prayed through seasons of joy and seasons of pain, become more aware than ever that God is not distant. He is here. He is near. He is settled. He is present. And your room, once ordinary, now carries the touch of the divine, not because the space itself is special, but because God chose to rest where you chose to seek him. The more you pray, the more the room becomes a resting place for divine presence. Number 8. Generational blessings begin forming and lingering in the space. There comes a moment in every praying life when you begin to realize that what God is doing in your room is bigger than you, bigger than your needs, your tears, your breakthroughs, your battles, bigger than the seasons you walked through and the ones you survived. Prayer, when it is consistent, when it is sincere, when it becomes the rhythm of your life, does not just shape the atmosphere around you, it shapes the future after you. It reaches into the places you cannot see. It touches people you may never meet. It lays foundations for generations not yet born. And your room, the space where you have cried out, surrendered, worshipped, pleaded, thanked, whispered, and waited, becomes the birthplace of blessings that outlive your lifetime. Generational blessings do not appear suddenly. They form slowly, layer by layer, with every prayer you speak in faith. Each surrender you give, each burden you release, each moment you bow your heart in that room contributes to something being built in the unseen. Heaven does not waste what is formed in prayer. God gathers every word, every sigh, every moment your spirit reached for him, and he begins weaving them into a tapestry that stretches beyond your years. The room becomes a vault of spiritual inheritance, a place where the seeds of blessing are planted with your obedience and watered with your consistency. There are moments when you pray and you feel like nothing is shifting. You pray for your family, your children, your lineage, and you wonder if your words are strong enough to reach beyond your walls. But heaven hears differently than earth listens. Where you feel small, heaven sees foundation. Where you feel uncertain, heaven sees construction. Where you feel delayed, heaven sees preparation. Your prayers begin forming generational blessings the moment they leave your lips. And those blessings linger in the air long after your voice is silent. Your room becomes a sanctuary, not just for you, but for those who will come after you. The atmosphere holds the residue of faith. The walls remember the sound of your intercession. The space becomes spiritually conditioned by the battles you fought and the victories you secured. Children who grow up in that house may not understand why they feel safe or comforted or drawn to peace without explanation. They may not know the prayers you prayed, the nights you wrestled, the tears you shed, but they will walk into the blessing those prayers created. They will breathe in the peace your surrender produced. They will inherit strength they never earned because you fought for it on your knees. Generational blessings begin forming in the room because prayer changes the spiritual DNA of a family line. Where fear once ruled, faith becomes the foundation. Where cycles once repeated, curses break and blessings build. Where pain once traveled through generations, healing begins traveling instead. Your room becomes the womb of that transformation. It becomes the place where spiritual patterns shift, where God begins writing a different story for your lineage. Every time you pray, you are sowing seeds into the soil of generations, and heaven nurtures what you plant with a faithfulness beyond your reach. There is a moment in prayer when the blessing being formed is not only for your children, but for your children's children. You may not see their faces. You may never hear their laughter. You may never know their struggles or the chapters of their lives. But heaven does. And God answers your prayers with a vision wider than your lifetime. When you pray for protection, it extends beyond the present moment. When you pray for purpose, it anchors future hearts. When you pray for breakthrough, it becomes a door generations walk through. Your room becomes the place where spiritual inheritance begins to breathe. Angels who enter your room recognize this shift. They see the blessing forming long before you do. They see heaven writing promises over your family line in the very space where you kneel. They see the foundation being laid for descendants who have not yet taken their first breath. They see the atmosphere thick with purpose that will one day guide a child toward calling, identity, and destiny. To angels, your room is not just the place where you pray. It is the place where blessing is being constructed from the ground up. There are prayers you pray that heaven does not answer immediately, not because you are unheard, but because the blessing being built is too deep for a quick response. Generational blessings require time. They require layering. They require spiritual alignment. God is not only answering for you, He is preparing an inheritance for those who will stand on the foundation you set. Every time you push through exhaustion and whisper one more prayer in that room, you are adding another stone to their blessing. Every time you choose faith over fear, you carve a path they will walk with confidence. Every time you choose forgiveness, you break chains that would have reached them. Every time you choose surrender, you release burdens they will never have to carry. The room becomes something like a spiritual lighthouse, drawing future generations toward God without them understanding why. They will feel peace in that space even before they learn the language of prayer. They will sense safety in that atmosphere even before they know the meaning of faith. They will be drawn to that room not because of the furniture, not because of the decor, but because of the spiritual inheritance lingering in the air. God builds altars out of rooms where prayer has been poured out, and altars attract destiny. In time, the blessing becomes so settled, so rooted, so woven into the fabric of the room that even after you move, even after time passes, even after life shifts, the residue of your prayers continues to speak. Your spiritual labor leaves a footprint that does not erase. It becomes part of the home's foundation, part of the spiritual geography of your lineage. Rooms remember the faith poured into them. They remember the battles fought, the victories secured, the promises declared, and they echo those blessings into the lives of those who come after. Your prayers become their protection. Your devotion becomes their covering. Your surrender becomes their strength. Your faith becomes their inheritance. And all of it begins in the quiet sacredness of your room, where years of prayer transform the atmosphere into a living testament of everything God has done, everything He is doing, and everything He will continue to unfold long after your voice has grown silent. Generational blessings begin here, in the unseen moments, in the whispered prayers, in the quiet hours, in the yearning for God's presence. And heaven honors every moment you choose to pray, building blessings that will outlive you, breathe beyond you, and carry your family line into a future shaped by the power you released in your room. There are rooms in this world that look ordinary to human eyes. Same walls, same furniture, same quiet corners, but in the spirit, they appear as fortified realms, illuminated by years of whispered prayers and private surrender. Spaces marked by prayer are not like other spaces. They carry a weight, a glow, a resonance you cannot manufacture with candles or decor. They hold something heaven recognizes instantly. Angels do not guard every place the same way. They guard according to assignment, according to spiritual activity, according to the presence of God that has been welcomed, invited, and honored over time. And when a room becomes saturated with prayer, heaven assigns angels not merely to visit it, but to watch over it. Angels guard prayer-marked spaces because prayer creates spiritual ownership. When you pray in a room repeatedly, when you pour out your heart, when you break chains, when you release burdens, when you surrender your fears, that room becomes spiritually claimed. It becomes a place where heaven has been invited to dwell. Darkness does not have permission to wander freely in a place where God has been consistently hosted. And angels stand on that boundary line. They recognize the spiritual territory. They recognize the covenant established through prayer. They recognize the reverence given to God in that space. The room ceases to be common. It becomes consecrated. And consecrated spaces are guarded spaces. You may not see them, but angels take their positions. Some stand at doorways as sentinels. Some linger in corners as watchmen. Some move through the atmosphere, ensuring no spiritual disturbance takes root. Some stand guard over the bed where your tears have soaked the pillow. Some stand near the window where you once prayed for breakthrough. Their presence is not theatrical, it is protective. Angels guard the entry points of a room the way warriors guard the gates of a city. They are attentive to movement, sensitive to spiritual shifts, alert to anything that threatens your peace or attempts to invade the sanctuary created through your prayers. A room marked by prayer becomes a place where angels do not merely intervene, they inhabit. They do not wait to be summoned, they remain. They do not visit occasionally, they dwell with assignment. Prayer transforms an ordinary space into a spiritual stronghold, and angels recognize strongholds of light the way darkness recognizes strongholds of bondage. To them, your prayer-filled room appears as a lit chamber in the spirit realm, a region of safety, a refuge, a lamp shining against whatever shadows wander nearby. And just as light repels darkness, this spiritual glow repels unclean influences. Angels guard such spaces because prayer has established a border that darkness cannot cross without confrontation. When you pray in your room year after year, you establish spiritual patterns. Heaven knows that room as a place of conversation. Angels learn its rhythm. They know when you rise. They know when you cry. They know when you surrender something heavy. They know when you pour out gratitude in the silence. And because prayer sustains connection between heaven and that space, angels guard it with a vigilance stronger than anything your physical eyes could ever imagine. Their guarding is not passive. It is active, intentional, and deeply responsive. When fear tries to creep into the room, angels stand firm. When you have a restless night and something tries to disrupt your peace, angels intervene. When your mind is weighed down and dark thoughts try to enter, angels block the doorway of your spirit. When you wake at 3 a.m. with pressure pressing against your heart, angels confront whatever tries to reach you. They do not guard casually, they guard fiercely. Because prayer has made the room a spiritually valuable place, and heaven always protects what has been dedicated to God. There are nights when you feel a sudden calm after being anxious. That calm is not random. It is something pushed back, something held off, something redirected by angelic presence. There are times you sense peace covering you like a blanket when you are overwhelmed. That peace did not arrive alone. Angels bring it. Angels enforce it. Angels guard it. What you feel emotionally is the result of what they fight spiritually. There are moments when you wake and sense the room feels different, lighter, cleaner, sharper, clearer. That is because angels have spent the night guarding the atmosphere. They remove what does not belong. They restore what was disturbed. They maintain the environment your prayers laid in place. They guard spaces marked by prayer the same way gardeners guard delicate flowers, attentively, constantly, intentionally. Prayer creates consistency, and consistency creates habitation. Where prayer dwells, angels dwell. They are drawn to prayer the way bees are drawn to flowers. Prayer is their language. It is the atmosphere in which they operate with greatest clarity. If you could see in the spirit, you would see that some of the strongest angelic presence rests in rooms that have witnessed years of prayer, especially quiet prayers, midnight prayers, broken prayers, surrender prayers, the kind of prayers that rewrite atmospheres, the kind that reach God even when whispered through tears. Angels guard prayer marked spaces because darkness remembers what used to happen there before you started praying. Darkness remembers when it had access to your mind. It remembers when fear was allowed to visit freely. It remembers when heaviness hovered without resistance. But the moment prayer took root, that access was revoked. And angels enforce that revocation. They guard the new reality of the room. They guard the spiritual transformation you built on your knees. They guard the atmosphere that prayer established. What angels see when they guard your space is different from what you see. They see the glow of every prayer still lingering in the air. They see the marks of spiritual battles already won. They see the imprints of God's presence resting on the bed where you cried for His help. They see how the room has been reshaped by your faithfulness. They see the atmosphere charged with memories of God's interventions. And because they see this, they guard it with reverence. Angels also guard the room because what happens there affects future generations. When a space becomes a place of prayer, the spiritual inheritance connected to that space grows. Even if you move homes, the habit of prayer you built will follow you. But while you remain in that room, angels protect the generational seeds being planted in the atmosphere. They guard the blessings forming in silence. They guard the shifts happening in your lineage. They guard the patterns God is rewriting through you. The room is not simply where you pray, it is where spiritual history is being shaped. Sometimes angels guard you from things you cannot even sense. They guard your dreams. They guard your subconscious. They guard your emotional world. They guard your mind from spiritual interference. They guard your heart from heaviness meant to discourage you. They guard your calling from attacks meant to derail you. They guard your sleep because your sleep is part of your spiritual strength. They guard the atmosphere so you can rise in the morning ready to step into what God has prepared for you. Their presence is not meant to be noticed, but its effects are impossible to ignore. You feel lighter, you breathe easier, you sleep deeper, you think clearer, you sense peace that does not match your circumstances. You feel strength in moments you expected to feel weak. These experiences are not accidents, they are evidence of guarding. Angels guard prayer-marked spaces because such spaces are gateways of heaven on earth. They are places where the spiritual and natural intersect. They are places where God meets with humanity in quiet, consistent, transformative ways. And heaven always protects a meeting place. So when you enter your room after years of prayer, do not think of it as four walls and a door. Understand that heaven sees it as a spiritual fortress. Understand that angels are already there, standing where you once stood in surrender. Understand that the atmosphere is alive with victory. And understand that as long as prayers fill that room, angels will guard it with unwavering strength, ensuring that nothing can disturb what God is building within its sacred walls. There is a reason certain rooms feel different the moment you step into them. A reason the air feels softer, the atmosphere feels steady, and something unseen seems to wrap itself around your spirit. It is because some rooms are marked by prayer, marked by surrender, marked by worship, marked by moments when heaven was invited again and again until the space itself shifted. Angels recognize these places. They recognize the rooms where God has been welcomed, honored, acknowledged, pursued. And when heaven is invited into a room repeatedly, angels visit not as strangers, but as familiar beings returning to a place where divine activity has already made a home. Angels do not enter every space with the same freedom. They move according to spiritual laws, divine patterns, and the posture of the human heart. A room where God has been consistently invited has a spiritual signature. It has a resonance. It carries the fragrance of devotion, the sound of whispered prayers, the echo of surrender, the residue of faith. These rooms are not spiritually neutral. They are spiritually alive. And because they are alive, angels visit them with purpose. They visit because God is there. Not in a metaphorical sense, but in a tangible spiritual presence that fills the atmosphere. When God is welcomed into a space, heaven responds accordingly. Angels are drawn to the presence of God like light is drawn to darkness. It arrives to illuminate, to align, to strengthen, to protect. Rooms marked by prayer become places where heaven rests. Angels do not come merely to observe these spaces. They come because they are assigned to them. They come because these rooms become spiritual intersections where heaven and earth meet. When you repeatedly invite God into your room, through prayer, through worship, through quiet communion, your room becomes a landing place for the divine. Angels visit because the spiritual climate is clean. Chaos does not live there. Darkness cannot root itself there. Worry cannot dominate there. A prayed-in room becomes a spiritually breathable place where heaven does not feel resisted. Angels visit because your prayers have driven out what once claimed authority over the space. Prayer dethrones darkness. It strips the enemy of access. And when access is removed, angels move in with full strength. Angels also visit rooms marked by prayer because your spirit becomes more receptive in those spaces. A prayed-in room changes you. It softens your heart. It calms your mind. It aligns your thoughts. Angels do not waste their presence. They visit places where your spirit is open enough to hear, sense, receive, and perceive. In a space saturated with prayer, you are more likely to receive divine impressions, guidance, strength, and encouragement because the atmosphere has already been prepared for visitation. Angels visit because the room has been tuned to heaven's frequency. They visit because your prayers create spiritual activity. Every prayer spoken in that room becomes a stone laid in a spiritual foundation. Every moment you surrendered fear, every tear you cried in God's presence, every word you whispered into the darkness created motion in the unseen realm. Angels move on the energy of obedience and faith. When you pray, heaven responds. Angels carry the response. They bring peace. They bring clarity. They bring protection. They bring the answer. They bring the strength you asked for and the help you didn't know you needed. Angels visit your room because your prayers have formed an ongoing dialogue between you and heaven. Angels visit because your room becomes familiar to them. Heaven remembers spaces the way humans remember memories. When you pray consistently in one place, angels associate that space with divine purpose. They recognize it as a spiritual territory under God's covering. They know the space. They have moved through it. They have guarded its walls. They have stood beside you during your broken moments. They have watched you worship through pain. They have heard you speak faith when fear tried to crush you. Angels visit because they know the room carries history soaked in prayer. They visit because your room becomes a spiritual light in the unseen realm. Rooms where God is invited shine differently. Angels do not navigate by physical sight. They follow spiritual signals. A prayed-in room emits a brightness that cannot be hidden. It is a lighthouse in the spirit. It signals, God dwells here. His presence rests here. His people meet him here. Angels visit places touched by divine glory. They visit because heaven recognizes the mark on the space. Angels also visit because your room becomes a place of assignment. When you pray, you create spiritual appointments. You open doors for heaven to intervene, protect, and guide. Angels visit because your room becomes the headquarters of your spiritual life. They come to deliver messages, to strengthen you, to fight for you, to prepare you for what lies ahead. They come because the room has become a place where heaven works. They visit because the presence of God sanctifies physical space. When God enters a room, that room becomes holy, not in the religious sense, but in the sense that it is set apart. It becomes purified. It becomes spiritually secure. Angels visit secure spaces with ease. They move freely in rooms that have been cleansed by prayer. They do not have to push through resistance. They do not have to confront darkness blocking the entrance. A prayed-in room is spiritually open, spiritually accessible, spiritually protected. Angels visit because God's presence makes the space accessible. Angels visit because they are drawn to faith. Faith changes the environment. It raises the spiritual temperature. It shifts the atmosphere into one heaven recognizes. Angels respond to faith the way fire responds to oxygen. Faith fuels their assignments. Your room, when filled with years of prayer, becomes a storage place of faith. Every prayer you prayed in weakness but offered anyway became part of the spiritual climate. Angels visit because faith invites them. They visit because your room has become a place of covenant. When you pray repeatedly in one space, you form a spiritual pattern. You release promises. You speak declarations. You create vows. Whether quietly or loudly, your spirit enters into covenant with God. Angels recognize those covenants. They guard them. They honor them. They enforce them. They ensure that the spiritual agreements spoken in that room remain protected. Angels also visit because your room becomes a refuge. When you have cried in that room, when you have broken down in that room, when you have sought God in desperation in that room, angels were there. They were assigned not just to you, but to the healing process that took place. They watched you trust God through seasons that tried to destroy you. They guarded your heart in nights when you felt emotionally fragile. They strengthened you in moments you almost gave up. Angels visit because your room became the place where heaven held you together. They visit because prayer marks territory. Your room becomes claimed by the kingdom of God. Angels visit territory that belongs to their king. They stand guard. They reinforce spiritual boundaries. They monitor what tries to enter. They keep peace in place. They protect the sacredness of the atmosphere. Angels visit because your room has become holy ground. Most of all, angels visit rooms where God has been invited because relationship has been established. Heaven does not respond to performance. Heaven responds to connection. And when you have met God consistently in one space, the relationship you formed there becomes woven into the walls, the floors, the air. The room becomes a sanctuary, not because of decor, but because of devotion. Angels visit what God loves. They visit where His presence rests. They visit where His people seek Him. So when you walk into your room and feel something different, something peaceful, something sacred, do not dismiss it. You are feeling the residue of every encounter, every prayer, every spiritual victory. You are feeling the imprint of God's presence. You are sensing the nearness of angels who recognize the room as a place where heaven has been invited and welcomed. A prayed-in room becomes a meeting place between realms, a space where angels visit with purpose, a place touched by God. And once a room has been marked that way, heaven continues to return. There are some rooms that hold more than furniture. Some walls carry more than paint. Some floors bear more than footsteps. There are spaces on this earth that have been saturated year after year, prayer after prayer, whisper after whisper, with a kind of spiritual residue that does not fade with time. These rooms become more than places where you live. They become places where heaven has visited, where tears have fallen, where breakthroughs have been birthed, where surrender has echoed, where God has been welcomed again and again until His presence becomes part of the atmosphere itself. And what many people never realize is that what you do in these sacred spaces does not end with you. It stretches past the boundaries of your lifetime. It touches the generations that come after you. It creates a spiritual inheritance that lingers in the very air long after your voice is gone. When you pray in the same space repeatedly, consistently, wholeheartedly, that place becomes a spiritual landmark. Heaven marks it. Angels recognize it. Darkness avoids it. But something even deeper happens. Your prayers begin to shape the lives of those not yet born. Your voice lays foundations under the feet of children who have not yet taken their first breath. Your surrender becomes a covering for descendants you will never meet. Your faith builds walls of protection around generations who may not even know why they feel safe. What you speak in private becomes the invisible inheritance of those who follow your lineage. Generational impact does not begin when a child is born. It begins when a life chooses to pray. Every whispered request, every tearful surrender, every midnight cry, every early morning declaration becomes a seed planted in the soil of the future. And seeds planted in prayer do not die. They multiply, they expand, they take root in places you cannot see. You may think you are praying for yourself, but heaven is hearing you pray for those who will come after. God does not limit your prayer to your lifespan. He carries it through time. He lets it echo into decades you will never walk. He allows your faith to become a covering for generations that have not yet found their own. There are rooms where ancestors once prayed, and though they are long gone, their prayers remain alive in the space. Some people step into a room and feel an unexplainable peace. They feel clarity. They feel safety. They feel a pull toward God that makes no logical sense. They do not realize they are stepping into a spiritual inheritance created by someone who knelt on that same floor 50 years before them. The prayers of those who came before do not vanish. They settle, they gather, they form layers of blessing that linger, waiting to touch whoever walks into the same space with an open heart. Your prayer room becomes a generational altar. Not an altar made of stone, but an altar made of consistency, devotion, intimacy with God. And altars do not disappear when the person who built them leaves the earth. They remain in the atmosphere, standing in the unseen, carrying the weight of every prayer ever lifted in that space. They become a place where heaven and earth have met over and over again, and because of that meeting, the room holds spiritual authority. Your children may one day stumble into that authority without fully understanding why prayers come naturally to them there. Your grandchildren may sit in that room and suddenly feel drawn to God without knowing that the pull they feel is the echo of your voice from decades before. Generational blessings are not fragile. They do not flicker like candles. They are more like oil that seeps into the walls of a place, into the air, into the very atmosphere. This oil does not evaporate. It permeates everything within reach. When someone prays faithfully in the same space, the oil of blessing becomes part of that room's identity. And identity, once established in the spirit, becomes difficult to erase. Rooms that have hosted prayers for years carry a thickness of glory even when the room sits empty. Time does not remove it. Silence does not dilute it. Darkness does not compete with it. It remains. Generational impact unfolds quietly. You may think your private prayers are small, unseen, insignificant, but heaven sees beyond your moment. Heaven sees the ripple. Heaven sees the chain reaction. Heaven sees the future bending itself to the words you speak today. A child you will never meet may one day encounter God because you prayed in that room. A descendant may be spared from a path of destruction because angels learned to visit that space regularly at your request. A future generation may walk in wisdom, peace, purpose, or protection because the atmosphere of that room shaped the direction of their spirit without them ever realizing why. There are moments when you pray and feel nothing, yet something eternal is happening. You think the walls are silent, but they are absorbing every word. You think the floor beneath you is still, but it is holding the imprint of every time you knelt there. You think no one sees the tear that falls, but heaven records every drop, and each one becomes a brick in the foundation of generational blessing. Foundations matter. They hold the weight of whatever is built upon them. Your prayers are becoming the foundation of a future you may not live to see. When your children walk into the room you prayed in for years, they will not just be walking into a physical space. They will be walking into a spiritual inheritance. They will breathe air shaped by your devotion. They will feel the safety your prayers carved into the atmosphere. They will stand on ground that has been sanctified by years of surrender. Even if they drift from God, something in that room will pull on their spirit. Even if they are stubborn, something will soften them. Even if they are confused, something will bring clarity. That something is not the room itself. It is the presence that has settled into the room because of your consistency. And long after you are gone, long after your footsteps have faded and your voice is no longer heard, the room you prayed in will still speak. It will still carry the imprint of your devotion. It will still hold the residue of your faith. It will still echo with the prayers you once whispered. Rooms marked by years of prayer become spiritual wells. Anyone who steps into them can draw from what you poured. Anyone who rests there can feel the peace you cultivated. Anyone who prays there can feel the ease you established. The spiritual heaviness others must work through will not exist there because you already fought the battles. You already pushed through the resistance. You already changed the climate. This is the generational impact of praying in the same space. It is legacy, not the kind written on paper, but the kind engraved in the atmosphere. It is inheritance, not the kind passed down in wealth, but the kind passed down in spirit. It is blessing, not the kind that fades, but the kind that grows. Every time you pray in that room, you are not only building your own relationship with God, you are building a spiritual home for someone who is not here yet. You are creating a place where future generations will find refuge, guidance, and peace. You are preparing a spiritual foundation for blessings that will outlive you. Your prayers may be quiet, but their impact is not. Your faith may be private, but its legacy will not be. Your devotion may be unseen, but its blessing will echo through your lineage. The room where you pray becomes a sanctuary today and a spiritual inheritance tomorrow. And long after your life has ended, your prayers will still be living, still moving, still shaping destinies yet to come. There is a profound truth that only becomes visible when you have prayed in the same room long enough, consistently enough, faithfully enough, that heaven begins to take notice of that space. A room saturated in prayer is not just a room anymore. It is not simply four walls and a ceiling. It becomes a spiritual chamber, a place where the supernatural and the natural meet, a sanctuary where heaven bends low enough for miracles to breathe. When prayers fill a space over years, something begins to shift in the unseen. Something begins to gather. Something begins to awaken. The room becomes more than a location. It becomes a portal of breakthrough. Breakthrough is not random. It does not fall without pattern. It is drawn to places where the atmosphere has been prepared, where faith has been planted, where surrender has been poured in tears and silence, where God has been welcomed again and again until the room itself begins to respond. Rooms saturated in prayer carry history, your history with God. Every whispered plea, every trembling surrender, every midnight cry, every whispered praise, every moment you collapsed in weakness, every moment you rose in strength, every battle you prayed through, every fear you confronted, every victory you celebrated, your room holds all of it. And those moments create layers in the atmosphere, layers that angels recognize, layers that darkness respects, layers that heaven honors. Breakthrough comes to rooms that have been spiritually softened. It comes where the ground of the atmosphere has been tilled by persistence. It comes where faith has been planted in the unseen soil of the air itself. A room soaked in prayer becomes like fertile land. Things grow there: clarity, healing, strength, revelation, direction, courage, and divine intervention. You may walk into that room one way, but rise from the floor another. You may enter in heaviness, but leave with a peace you cannot explain. That is because prayer alters the spiritual composition of a space. It changes the energy, the frequency, the tone of the room. What felt heavy becomes light. What felt stagnant becomes vibrant. What once echoed with silence begins to echo with presence. Breakthrough comes where God has been consistently invited. And your room remembers every invitation. Every time you asked him to come near, every time you reached out for him in exhaustion, every time you stretched your faith, even when you felt empty, every time you whispered his name in the dark, his presence marked the space. Presence leaves residue. Glory lingers. And after years, after seasons, after battles fought and victories witnessed, your room becomes a place where heaven is familiar. A place where angels recognize the air. A place where the Spirit of God feels welcomed, as if crossing a threshold into a familiar home. Breakthrough flows more easily in places where heaven feels at home. Rooms saturated in prayer become places of breakthrough because they hold spiritual memory. Just as your spirit remembers encounters with God, your environment begins to remember too. There is something different about praying where you've prayed before. The moment you step inside, your spirit begins to open. Your heart becomes softer. Your thoughts become clearer. It becomes easier to surrender, easier to listen, easier to believe, because your room has been conditioned to host the divine. It has become a sacred environment where spiritual resistance weakens the moment you arrive. Rooms saturated in prayer become places of breakthrough because darkness cannot root itself there. It may knock, it may try to settle, but prayer pushes it out. Prayer thins the shadows. Prayer exposes what tries to hide. Prayer cleans the corners of the atmosphere. Prayer creates spiritual boundaries that the enemy cannot cross. When darkness attempts to enter a prayer-soaked room, it finds no agreement, no foothold, no resting place. The room responds. The space pushes back. Your prayers have shaped the environment into a fortress. And where darkness cannot linger, breakthrough rises. Rooms saturated in prayer become places of breakthrough because the spiritual climate becomes charged with expectancy. Expectancy is the soil of miracles. When you pray in the same space repeatedly, you train your spirit to expect God to move there. Expectation changes the way you pray. It changes the way you hear. It changes the way you perceive. Expectation creates alignment. Alignment invites breakthrough. When you kneel in a space filled with expectation, you become more aligned with heaven's movement, more sensitive to divine timing, more open to receiving the answer you once begged for. Rooms saturated in prayer become places of breakthrough because heaven marks territory. Angels stand guard at the doorposts. The presence of God settles in the corners and moves through the air. Your room becomes a place where the supernatural is not rare but familiar, where visitation is not unusual but expected, where spiritual activity is not strange but welcome. Heaven gravitates toward places marked by devotion, and when heaven settles, breakthrough follows. Breakthrough does not always appear in dramatic form. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it arrives as peace where anxiety once lived. Sometimes it appears as a shift in your thinking. Sometimes it shows up as a new strength you didn't realize you were gaining. Sometimes it is a door opening in your life that you had stopped praying for. Sometimes it is closure. Sometimes it is healing. Sometimes it is release. Sometimes it is alignment. But all of these breakthroughs are born in spaces where the atmosphere has been prepared through years of prayer. Prayer shapes your room into a place where breakthrough becomes natural, not forced, not struggled for, natural. Because you are no longer fighting for breakthrough, you are stepping into a space that has been built for it. A room saturated in prayer becomes a spiritual landmark. Heaven knows it. Angels visit it. Darkness avoids it. Your spirit thrives in it. When you pray in such a room, you're not starting from zero. You're not trying to climb your way into God's presence. You're entering a space where a foundation has already been laid. Your room has become an altar without wood or stone, built entirely from whispered prayers and surrendered nights. And altars attract breakthrough. Rooms saturated in prayer become places of breakthrough because God honors consistency. Anyone can pray once. Anyone can cry out in desperation. But breakthrough is drawn to those who return again and again, who refuse to stop, who treat prayer not as a moment, but as a lifestyle. Your room carries the evidence of that consistency. It carries the strength of every time you chose prayer over panic, surrender over spiraling, belief over fear. Consistency opens the heavens, and the heavens open breakthrough. There is a reason you feel something different in that room. There is a reason tears fall more easily there. There is a reason peace settles quicker. There is a reason clarity arrives faster. The room is saturated. The atmosphere is alive. The presence is thick. The history is deep. Heaven recognizes that space as a place where God is welcomed, honored, trusted, and sought. And God responds to invitation with visitation. Visitation becomes habitation. Habitation becomes breakthrough. When a room has been filled with prayer for years, it becomes a spiritual womb for breakthrough, where new things are conceived, nurtured, and birthed into your life. Your prayers become seeds planted in the soil of your atmosphere. Your faith becomes water. Your surrender becomes sunlight. And the room becomes a greenhouse of spiritual growth. This is why some breakthroughs happen suddenly. They are not sudden. They were planted long ago. The room simply became ripe enough for them to manifest. So when you enter your prayer room, do not see it as ordinary. It is charged, it is marked, it is sacred. It has been shaped by your devotion and filled by God's presence. And every time you step into that space, you step into the possibility of breakthrough, not because you are striving for it, but because the room itself has become a place where breakthrough lives. There are rooms in this world that look ordinary to human eyes. 4 walls, a bed, a chair, a door. But in the spiritual realm, they are anything but ordinary. These are rooms where knees have bent night after night, where tears have fallen like seeds, where whispered prayers have risen like incense, where battles have been fought in silence, where surrender has been offered again and again. These are rooms that have been saturated, layer upon layer, with conversation between heaven and a willing heart. And in rooms like this, darkness loses its authority. It loses its footing. It loses its ability to influence, distort, or intimidate. Darkness cannot thrive in a place where God has been invited repeatedly, faithfully, intentionally, year after year. It can wander outside the door, but it cannot enter. It can watch, but it cannot touch. It can threaten, but it cannot prevail. A prayer-soaked room becomes a sanctuary not because of the furniture inside it, but because of the presence that has rested there. Darkness is not afraid of walls, but it trembles before presence. It recoils from consistency. It flees from rooms where God has become familiar. And when a room has absorbed years of intercession, something shifts in its spiritual structure. The atmosphere becomes charged with history, holy history, the kind that darkness recognizes long before you do, the kind that marks the room as claimed territory, set apart, guarded. Darkness may enter a place that is spiritually empty, but it cannot occupy a place that has been drenched in prayer. One of the first things darkness cannot do in a prayer-soaked room is remain comfortable. Prayer creates discomfort for anything unclean, anything deceptive, anything rooted in fear. The moment you begin to pray consistently in a space, you are not just speaking words, you are building an environment. You are shifting the air. You are rewriting the spiritual climate. Darkness needs agreement to stay, and prayer breaks agreement. Darkness needs permission to linger, and prayer removes permission. A room filled with prayer becomes suffocating to anything that thrives in confusion or fear. Darkness cannot rest where the name of God has been lifted consistently. It must leave. It must loosen its grip. It must respond to the authority that prayer establishes. Darkness also cannot manipulate your thoughts with the same power in a prayer-soaked room. The atmosphere of prayer works like a barrier around the mind. It slows intrusive thoughts. It disrupts lies before they take root. It blocks the doorways fear normally uses. You may feel pressure outside, but inside, your spirit knows peace. Inside, your mind remembers truth faster. Inside, your heart resets itself in the presence that has settled there. In a room where prayer lives, mental attacks lose strength. The enemy can whisper, but the whisper loses weight. It cannot sink deeply. It cannot entangle you the way it once did. Prayer creates clarity, and clarity is the enemy of deception. Darkness also cannot plant seeds in the atmosphere the way it does in spiritually dry places. Negative thoughts, oppressive emotions, spiritual tension, these require soil to grow. But prayer makes the atmosphere resistant. It purifies the soil. It refuses to let contamination settle. You may walk into the room with heaviness, but the heaviness cannot take root. It leaves faster than it came. It dissolves in the presence that prayer has established. A prayer-soaked space begins to work against darkness even before you utter a word. The atmosphere itself becomes defensive, protective, cleansing. The moment you step inside, your spirit remembers rest. Your mind remembers peace. Your body remembers safety. Darkness cannot cultivate anything in a room marked by spiritual purity. Another thing darkness cannot do is distort your identity in a room filled with prayer. When you have spent time seeking God in a particular space, crying out, confessing, surrendering, receiving, your spirit has learned who you are in the presence of God. A room like this becomes a place of remembering. When you enter it, the lies you carried begin to unravel. The insecurities you struggled with lose their power. The shame that tried to bury you cannot lift its head. Prayer declares identity again and again until identity becomes rooted. Darkness cannot speak loudly in a place where truth has been spoken repeatedly. Your room becomes a mirror reflecting who God says you are, rather than who fear tries to convince you to be. Darkness also cannot break the peace that settles in a prayer-soaked room. This peace is not emotional. It is not fragile. It is not dependent on circumstances. It is spiritual peace, placed, guarded, and sustained by the presence of God Himself. You may feel storms outside the room. You may walk through seasons of pressure. But the moment you step inside, peace greets you like a familiar friend. It envelops you. It calms you. It steadies your breathing and loosens the tension in your shoulders. Darkness cannot manufacture chaos in a place that has been saturated with divine peace. Peace becomes territorial. It stands guard. It refuses to surrender ground to fear. One of the most powerful things darkness cannot do in a prayer-soaked room is remain hidden. Prayer exposes what is trying to remain unseen. It brings clarity to confusion. It shines light on deception. It reveals motives, intentions, and spiritual atmospheres. When a room is filled with prayer, nothing can hide there. If something tries to creep into your spirit, you sense it immediately. If something tries to disrupt your peace, you recognize it at once. Discernment sharpens, awareness heightens, light fills the room's corners. Darkness cannot hide in a place where you have spent years kneeling, worshiping, and seeking God. Darkness also cannot silence your spirit in a prayer-soaked atmosphere. In spiritually dry rooms, the heart can feel numb, the mind sluggish, the spirit dull. But in a room where prayer has been practiced faithfully, your spirit awakens as soon as you enter. You feel sensitive to God. You feel connected. You feel open. Your spirit rises before your words do. Even when you feel tired, prayer begins to flow naturally. Even when you feel weak, your heart knows how to reach for God. Darkness cannot deaden a spirit that has learned to live in presence. The environment itself becomes a spiritual trigger that brings your soul back to life. In a prayer-soaked room, darkness also cannot claim ownership. It cannot mark the space. It cannot linger long enough to call it familiar territory. Prayer writes God's name on the walls of the unseen. It marks the space as belonging to Him. Angels recognize the room. Heaven recognizes the room, and darkness recognizes the room as well, and knows it cannot stay. Authority has been established, territory has been declared, and darkness is forced to respect the spiritual lines drawn through intercession. Perhaps the most profound thing darkness cannot do in a prayer-soaked room is remain after you leave. The presence stays, the peace stays, the protection stays. Prayer saturates a space so deeply that even when you walk out, the room remains spiritually alive. Anyone who enters can feel it. They may not have language for it, but they sense peace. They sense warmth. They sense something holy. Darkness feels it too and avoids it. A room soaked in prayer cannot be casually infiltrated. It is guarded, claimed, saturated in presence. When you pray consistently in a single space, you are not just speaking to heaven. You are shaping the spiritual fabric of your environment. And in doing so, you create a place where darkness has no power, no voice, no influence, no lasting presence. Your room becomes sanctuary. It becomes refuge. It becomes holy ground. And every time you enter it, you step into a space where heaven has history and darkness has no authority. What darkness cannot do is rule. What darkness cannot do is remain. What darkness cannot do is rewrite what prayer has built. And once you learn the power of a prayer-soaked room, you begin to realize that the atmosphere you create today becomes the protection you rely on tomorrow. When a room has been soaked in years of prayer, it becomes more than four walls and a ceiling. It becomes a sanctuary, a resting place, a spiritual landmark where heaven has walked beside you in silence and where God has listened to every whisper your heart couldn't hold alone. The atmosphere shifts, the battles change, the peace deepens, and you begin to understand that prayer never evaporates, it accumulates, it gathers, it builds, it lingers. Every moment you poured out before God has shaped this space into a place where breakthrough is natural, where clarity flows easily, where angels move freely, and where darkness cannot remain. So as we end this journey, I want to remind you of this truth. Your room is not ordinary. It is marked. It is known. It is spiritually alive because you chose to meet God there. And now, I invite you to pray with me. Lift your heart. Open your spirit. Let the same God who filled your room with peace fill you again right now. Wherever you are, He is near. Whatever you need, He is listening. Come, let us pray together and welcome His presence once more. Father, I come before you now in the same room where countless prayers have been whispered, cried, sung, and released into the atmosphere. I stand in this space that has soaked up years of petitions, confessions, hope, and worship. And I thank you that every prayer uttered here has never been lost, never been wasted, never been ignored. Lord, let this room remember who it belongs to. Let these walls recall the sound of my faith rising, even in moments when my strength was falling. Let the air around me testify that I have met you here again and again, and that your presence has never failed to answer the invitation. God, I thank you that this room has become more than just a room. It has become a sanctuary, a resting place for peace, a battlefield where victories were won long before I saw them with my natural eyes, a hiding place where I laid my fears at your feet, a holy ground where you taught me to breathe again when life felt heavy. Lord, I ask that you continue to saturate this space with your glory. Let every prayer spoken here settle like oil. Let it never evaporate. Let it cling to the atmosphere and shift everything that enters these four walls. Father, I lift my voice again and ask you to fill this room with your presence in a deeper way. Fill every corner, fill every shadow, fill every inch of air until your peace becomes the dominant reality. Let anxiety dissolve the moment it crosses the threshold. Let fear lose its voice as soon as it approaches. Let darkness forget how to operate here, for this is a room marked by prayer, a room claimed by heaven, a room angels recognize and guard. God, let your presence make this place too holy for torment, too bright for lies, too saturated with truth for deception to survive. Lord, you know every battle that has been fought in this room. You know every night I was on the edge of breaking, yet you held me together. You know the spiritual wars that unfolded while my body slept. You know the heaviness that tried to settle here, the doubt that tried to take root, the pain that tried to stay. And you also know the victories. You know the moments when breakthrough entered quietly. You know the nights when peace descended without warning. You know the mornings when I woke up lighter than I went to sleep. Father, let every battle won leave behind an imprint of victory so strong that it becomes part of the atmosphere. Let angels see those imprints as reminders that this room is a fortress, not a target. God, I pray that this space becomes a beacon in the spiritual realm. Let it shine with prayer that has accumulated over years. Let it glow with the glory of every moment you met me here. Let it pull heaven close and push darkness far. Let angels find it easily because they know this is a room where God has been welcomed again and again. Let this place become a resting point for divine activity, a home for revelation, a chamber for transformation. Lord, teach me to honor this room. Teach me to steward this sacred atmosphere. May my words not contaminate what prayer has purified. May my thoughts not pollute what worship has cleansed. May my actions not contradict the holiness you have established here. Let me treat this space as a place where you and I meet, where nothing is hidden, where everything is surrendered, where my soul is shaped and strengthened daily. Father, I ask that you saturate this room with generational blessing. Let every child who steps into this space feel peace they cannot explain. Let every visitor sense comfort they did not come looking for. Let every generation connected to me reap the benefits of what has been prayed here. Let the anointing resting in this room outlive me. Let it linger, settle, expand, and multiply. Let this be a room where generational cycles break, where new patterns begin, where blessings attach themselves to the lineage you have crafted for me. God, I ask that you assign angels to stand guard over this space. Let them stand at the door. Let them watch the windows. Let them fill the atmosphere. Let them carry the prayers I release and return with answers wrapped in your timing. Let them fight battles on my behalf. Let them push back anything that tries to enter with the intention of disrupting peace. Angels know the difference between a prayerless room and a prayer-soaked room, and I ask that they continue recognizing this one as a place where heaven touches earth. Lord, make this room uncomfortable for darkness. Let every attempt of fear dissolve before it forms. Let every whisper of doubt be silenced before it reaches my ears. Let every anxiety lose its grip the moment it tries to approach. Let no unclean presence feel welcome here. Let no negative thought find a place to rest. Let no burden settle here overnight. Let this room be a place where darkness has no strategy because prayer has taken full ownership of the atmosphere. Father, I ask you to continue expanding the spiritual capacity of this room. Let this be a place where visions flow, where understanding grows, where discernment sharpens, where revelation comes with clarity. Let me hear you more clearly in this room than anywhere else. Let me feel your nearness in a way that anchors my faith and strengthens my soul. Let this be the place where instruction is released, where wisdom arrives, where direction becomes clear. Lord, remind me that every prayer spoken here becomes part of a spiritual foundation. My whispered prayers strengthen the walls. My tears water the ground. My declarations build the atmosphere. Nothing is wasted. Every sound of faith rises and remains. Every release of surrender shapes the air. Every cry for help becomes a stone in the structure you're building. Let this room never lose the sound of my prayers. Let the echoes linger through the years. Let them rise back to you, even when I am silent. God, I thank you for what you have already done in this room, but I also thank you for what you are still building here. You are not finished saturating this space. You are not done filling this atmosphere. You are not done shaping me through the stillness, the silence, the tears, and the whispered words. Keep working in me. Keep working in this room. Keep letting heaven rest here. Lord, I give this room to you again. Make it holy, make it peaceful, make it powerful, make it yours. Let every moment spent here bring me closer to you. Let every prayer spoken here rise like incense. Let every morning begin with your presence. Let every night end with your peace. And let this room remain a place where heaven does not visit occasionally, but dwells continually. Amen. We're so glad you joined us. If this message spoke to you about Jesus' grace, type Amen in the comments. Watch another uplifting video by clicking on the left and subscribe to stay connected to His truth. May the peace of Jesus fill your heart.